Good afternoon. This is Victoria Beal with the Ohio LTAP Center, and I want to thank you for joining us for this afternoon's webinar on rebalancing streets for people. I have with me Sally Sharrow and Gwen Shaw, who will be your presenters, and I'm going to turn things over to them in just a moment. But before I do that, there are two items I'd like to go over with you housekeeping-wise. First off, on the GoToWebinar panel, you'll see a handout section, and I wanted to encourage you to go there and download a copy of today's slides. If for some reason your technology isn't cooperating and it won't let you download it, don't worry, because I'll send an email out afterwards with a link to the slides as well. But if you want to have them already saved on your desktop, that's where you can get the document from. The second thing I wanted to ask is for you to find the questions box in the GoToWebinar panel. And as a couple of folks who've probably been on webinars with me before know, I like to have you drop a hi or hello in there, just to make certain that you know where that box is at, so you can ask questions as the webinar proceeds. So thank you to everyone who's putting your hi or hello in there, much appreciated. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to our presenters. Are you ready, Sally?
Yeah, thanks so much, Victoria. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. This is the Rebalancing Streets for People webinar, which is sponsored by Creating Healthy Communities, a program of the Ohio Department of Health, and with the generous help of ODOT and the LTAP program. So thank you for hosting us today. And we really appreciate all of you taking the time to join us and talk a little bit about this topic. So communities around the world are still adapting to this new and ever-changing normal as the COVID-19 pandemic continues. One unanticipated dilemma is how to enable people to walk, bike, and run outside while still social distancing. Our popular parks and trails are filled with many people exercising, trying to get some fresh air, and just taking care of their mental health outside. Many sidewalks and bike lanes are also at capacity as our essential workers walk, ride, and scoot instead of taking transit in many cases. At the same time, a lot of streets are still pretty eerily empty of cars, and the pressure is on to rebalance our streets, at least temporarily, to provide more places that are safe for people to walk, bike, and run while maintaining a safe physical distance from each other. So how can we make this transformation happen? And that's what we're going to be talking about today. And we look forward to any comments on experiences that all of you have had or questions you have as we go through. So yeah, any questions you throw into the question box, we will address at some stopping points within the presentation, and should hopefully have some time for conversation or questions at the end. My name is Sally Sharrow. I am a project planner at Tool Design based in Columbus, Ohio. And I spend a lot of my time working with the Ohio Department of Health and the CHC program, talking about how active transportation can promote health in our communities. And I am also presenting today with my colleague, Gwen Shaw, and I will let her give herself a quick introduction as well.
Hey everyone, my name is Gwen Shaw, engineer here in the Portland office of Tool Design, and I'm really excited to get to kind of be with what I like to say is the other ODOT, though I'm sure most people here think of our Oregon DOT as the other ODOT, but it's great to be here today. I'm excited to share all sorts of information and experience and be part of that question and answer as well. So with that, I think I will just jump right into the presentation. So I have three main points to make in this introduction. First, I think it's really important to acknowledge just how dramatically and quickly this pandemic has exposed systemic inequities in so many aspects of our daily life, from healthcare and employment to housing, access to food, and of course, transportation. And to take a moment to reflect on the fact that these inequities have been there all along and were the daily reality for millions of Americans before this pandemic. The solutions that we develop need to be applied with equity, ethics, and empathy now more than ever. Second, at the same time, we witness an extraordinary social experiment in real time. Across the globe and locally, air quality improved as auto traffic disappeared from the streets. We learned about which travel is truly essential, how much work can really be done remotely, and in a twist, cleaner air helps some of the people who are most at risk if they contract COVID-19, people with asthma and other respiratory issues. So this is the silver lining of a pretty dark cloud, but something we can celebrate and learn from. And on the screen, you can see that just in central Ohio, the 2020 ozone pollution was 8% below the 5-year average and is running near the 20 low values. So doing great on that front. And third, and we say this 6 months into the pandemic and it hasn't changed much since the beginning, our worlds look very different and many communities are eager to return to normal. Ohio has made great strides to contain the pandemic, but it is still very much a reality affecting our daily lives. While this will eventually pass and there will be a return to some sense of normal, we have seen that the return to normal is not happening as abruptly as we thought it would at the start of the pandemic. And we still just don't know what this is going to look like. Those who are older or immunocompromised are likely to work from home longer. Some people have adapted to and are even happier with working from home. Outdoor activity continues to be an important outlet for many. We'll be talking today about approaches that are relevant to the ongoing and immediate needs of the pandemic, but they are also relevant to what a resilient, adaptable community looks like in the long run as lifestyles change, restrictions cycle in and out, and future challenges arise. We should keep these temporary facilities in place as long as they are needed, so we should also monitor how they are being used as conditions change. If social distancing does become cyclical, then we need to be prepared to install these temporary facilities or reinstall temporary facilities again in the future. So ensure that you have plans in place to address those needs. And I want to be deliberate to address an issue right at the start, as it's something that's been brought up since we first gave a version of this presentation in early April. Several of our clients and colleagues have reached out to ask if we are suggesting strategies that go against orders that require people to stay at home. Strategies that might result in more people outdoors and in close proximity to each other. There have been some concerns about people flocking to parks and trails and creating conditions where the virus can spread. And I don't think that all health departments are necessarily in agreement about this issue, but clearly these things can be safe if we're following social distancing and maintaining physical separation. And at this point, 6 months in, there's minimal evidence to suggest this type of activity causes large outbreaks. So no, we are not suggesting that people congregate in the same place at the same time. Rather, we want to create conditions where there are more safe places for people to walk, bike, or jog using safe distancing strategies, not less space to do these activities. And we certainly need to be careful about doing things that could attract a lot of people to one location, and there are a few factors here at play. First, we need to remember that physical activity and time outside of the house is absolutely essential for humans to maintain their physical and emotional health. There are volumes of scientific research that shows that being outside, experiencing nature, even if it's just a street tree, being out in the sunshine, all of these things bring a wide variety of physical and mental benefits to humans. In fact, they boost our immune systems. Even as little as 30 minutes of exercise a day, a simple walk, or a run or a bike ride outside boosts our immune systems and makes us healthier. So we need to find solutions to allow people to continue to safely spend time outside. The time we've already spent at home is wearing on people, and spending time outside has been an outlet for many, but not everyone has the same opportunity to do so safely, which can lead to detrimental effects that have on mental and physical health. So even with strict stay-at-home orders having been lifted, there's likely to be an extended period of time when this virus is still with us, as we're seeing right now and we're going to see for who knows how long. We're gradually reopening society, but we still have a need to maintain physical separation, and we continue to have a need to get from place to place by walking and biking. It's important to acknowledge that city and state leaders are making decisions without much of a playbook to rely on. Decisions on whether packed trails and parks are simply closed or more spaces added alongside them are equally understandable and have led to very different outcomes in cities such as Minneapolis, Chicago, Los Angeles. I'm pretty sure we all want more safe places to be active, so let's figure out how to make that happen. I also want to acknowledge that this is a very busy time for public works departments. These staff are in crisis mode and being drafted into roles that they have not had to play before. Diverting resources to close roads for more space for walking and biking may not be the top of their list of priorities. I don't know who Honky Rules Spools is, but the sentiment he expresses is worth considering. But now that we've been living with the new reality of extended periods of time in isolation, and with businesses and workplaces being gradually reopened, having enough space on our streets and sidewalks is still important. And before our normal patterns of traffic and travel return, which we'll get to in a little bit, we still have an opportunity now to experiment with some things to prepare for that time. Before we dive into the recommendations, I would just want to add that we aren't here to advocate one course of action over another. We're here to share with you a series of practical steps and things to consider from other places that have been implemented or that have been implementing these kinds of changes as you begin to plan or continue your efforts to enable folks to be outside and practice safe distancing in your community. So with that, let's dive in. As we look at the way streets have been used in the past months, we see that motor vehicles are in flux. They've decreased notably, though they're starting to return to normal levels. INRIX, which is a nationwide firm that tracks traffic data, high-level traffic data, showed that initially we saw downturn of about 40%, or volumes were down 40% nationwide, and data from local agencies in Ohio showed that similar changes were happening. We also know that our traffic volumes don't have the same morning and evening surge at the peak hours. The research on speeding in Ohio's 3 biggest cities saw significant increases in the average levels of speeding and also a tripling of the proportion of roadways on which people were speeding. So said another way, nearly everyone is speeding. So the volumes are down or are in flux, but the speeding is heavy. When there are fewer cars and obstacles on the roads, it's much easier and enticing for people to speed. And although traffic volumes have decreased a bit, this does not seem to have led to a decrease in fatal crashes. In late July, crashes in Ohio were down by 25% compared to the previous year, but there were at least 18 additional traffic deaths compared to the previous year. Pedestrian deaths in the first 6 months of 2020 were also up, with the highest number of fatalities in the past 10 years. These increasingly fatal crashes are likely contributable to the excess speeds. And finally, at this point, there seems to be evidence that traffic volumes are starting to return to pre-COVID numbers across the country. So if you look at this map, you can see that we've got kind of the purple and blue are the below pre-COVID, that teal is right at pre-COVID levels. The green and yellow are getting to above COVID levels. So if you look at this slide, the first image is April, we're in that purple to blue, some greens, very few yellow. So volumes are down. If you go to the next slide, you can see in June, that has completely shifted. We are now seeing 25 to 100% above pre-COVID level. This is, very nationwide, very high level, big data, but it's really interesting just to see what is causing this. Yes, there is somewhat of a return to normal, but it's not the same as the pre-COVID normal. We're still down in urban centers, but rising elsewhere. We think that one thought of this is that it could be attributed to local travel, lots fewer air trips and more people driving state to state or within their state in response to, not being able to fly elsewhere. We've also seen a substantial evidence that the demand for active transportation and numbers of people using trails has skyrocketed, often leading to crowded conditions in trails and parks. We've seen this nationally and locally. In many places, people have been walking in the streets because their sidewalks are too narrow to maintain sufficient space for social distancing. This may work okay on lower volume streets, but without clarity of the spaces we're putting pedestrians in, a road where motorists can be driving very quickly. So a couple examples are on the next slide of places all around the US and globally that have begun to think about rethinking their streets. So next we'll go over a couple other suggested ideas. One street type that's an easy opportunity to accommodate more space for walking and biking is a typical 4-lane road. Normally, for 4-lane roads, we'd be talking about a 4 to 3 lane road diet, but that's not practical for rapid implementation. or doing it quickly. For these roads with their decreased vehicle usage, we can carve out the outside lane for use by people walking, biking, or both. These are recommended as an option because they can be easy to install. There's no need to move signal heads or make other major physical changes. These types of installations only require someone to drive the truck, someone to drop barrels or cones off the back, and someone to walk or bike behind, ensuring that everything is placed in the right direction, right locations. We recommend taking an inventory of what materials you have in your stockyard or what your on-call contractors have in stock so that these can be implemented quickly. As I mentioned before, the streets in their existing conditions are like every car commercial you've ever seen, wide open roads that accommodate fast speeds. By narrowing these roads to one lane in each direction, it will help to address this issue, but we will need to be deliberate at intersections to ensure we're slowing the speeds of turning vehicles. Just as we need to have bicyclists biking responsibly, and we'll get to that in a moment, we also need drivers to be driving responsibly to keep people safe and reduce the strain on our hospitals. You can also consider localized implementation of parking lane closures or other lane closures where people are queuing to get into stores and where you have existing sidewalks. You could consider implementation where you may have done pop-ups in the past, pop-up events in the past, or where you've done closed streets for farmers markets, street festivals, etc. These are places where your public works staff already know how to set up the traffic control, and you probably already have plans, so you can just pull those off the shelf and repurpose them. Pop-up events are also frequently set up as loops, so it helps to keep people local and remaining in their community. Many communities are using road closures to provide the space that people need to practice social distancing, particularly on streets with existing narrow sidewalks. Example of closures includes the initial 13 plus miles in Denver, 10 miles in Minneapolis, 7.5 miles in Portland, 6 miles in Cleveland, so many, 5 miles in Winnipeg. These can be done with limited treatments like a few cones or a type 3 barricade. Just ensure that vehicles can still physically get into and out of the street if you're maintaining local access. To reduce the strain on public works staff, these could potentially be done as DIY closures where the people living on the street would keep the cones in place. Public works may need to drop off the cones, or in some instances, people can put out chairs with signs on them. You probably already have a process in place for block parties to close streets, so you could repurpose that process as well, noting that we're not allowing these to function as block party spaces. There's a couple different models that have been popping up in the last couple of weeks. For example, Portland has contracted with a local event firm that is, not able to be setting up fencing for large events on our waterfront. And so they've partnered with one of the local advocacy groups to do exactly this, kind of neighborhood ambassadors. So it's a little bit more than DIY, but it's still not being done by Public Works, where community members can sign up to maintain these barricades on these residential streets. You can also consider which streets people may be likely to use to get to transit, especially as some local services, are figuring out what they're going to be doing long term, and ensure that those streets can safely accommodate the movement of people. So thinking about the natural desire lines of people and working to accommodate that. But we also know that our trails and just sidewalks and a lot of our pedestrian facilities are just simply not wide enough to accommodate people social distancing. In most cases, our trails couldn't even accommodate weekend volumes when we weren't practicing social distancing, and this is creating a real dilemma for jurisdictions around the country. One option is to look for routes parallel to the trails and close those to cars, either entirely or partially, and have those serve as kind of a relief valve for the trails. This could also help to separate users, noting that bicyclists aren't on the trails during this pandemic to travel for recreation. They may or may not be on there for traveling to work, essential businesses. So this would be kind of the recommendation for everyone. Also recognize that trails are often served as I was saying, the backbone of transportation system. And so you want to make sure that you're providing both uses and separating pedestrians and bicyclists and their differential speeds accordingly. We need to stop forcing people to push buttons. This is an obvious one, and I suspect it's why so many places have been doing this. We don't really recommend bagging the push buttons, especially ones that have the audible system for ADA accessibility, because you need to make sure that those can be maintained for vision disabilities and for noise. And they may still be needed for navigation and cues in general, but you can put the signals in pedestrian recall so that people aren't forced to touch them. And then you can sign them accordingly so that people therefore don't touch them. Also, we want to recognize that we don't want people gathering on corners as they wait to cross streets. So many signals run different signal timings during the peak hour versus the middle of the day or nighttime operations. When we're in this pandemic, that may not be as necessary. So when we're in the signal cabinet turning on pedestrian recall, we can similarly switch the cycle lengths to use those midday or nighttime operations phasing, which typically are a little bit more pedestrian friendly as they're not as focused on getting those vehicle volumes through. We'd recommend putting signals in flash as we want to maintain controlled crossings when people are present. You can also consider adjusting the signal timing to encourage slower speeds for vehicle progression along the corridors, especially those that are identified to prioritize bicyclists and pedestrians. This may throw some of your cross-street progression out of whack, but that may be fine given the noticeably lower volumes of motorists. And as we transition into fall and winter, it will become even more critical to get signal timing right for the people on foot. And to keep sidewalks clear and corners of snow, clear of snow. The need for essential travel and recreation will not go away as the weather changes, and so bike facilities should be worked into snow maintenance schedules. Tool Design has a winter maintenance resource guide full of 12 great tips available on our website, so feel free to check that out for more details. And it kind of goes into some best practices and policies for maintaining these bike and pedestrian facilities during the winter time and heavy snow. Couple other ideas before I pass it off to Sally. We can consider lowering speeds. These are temporary changes that could be implemented to ensure that people walking and biking along and within the streets are not exposed to speeding drivers. So we want everyone to be moving safely on our streets. You can also have some localized opportunities to remove on-street parking and ask people to park in nearby parking lots. You know your neighborhoods best, so I'm sure you can think of 1 or 2 locations where this may be a potential opportunity to remove on-street parking and use that parking lane for walking and or biking. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Sally.
Thanks, Gwen. Were there any questions? We can take a minute here if there's any questions that have come up on some of the ideas we've talked about so far, or any comments that anybody wanted to share.
There's no questions or comments that have come in yet, but they can definitely type those in and I'll get them right over to you.
Great. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the planning considerations and messaging behind some of these ideas. The road and lane closures that we're talking about are not intended to be destinations in themselves. They're intended to be spaces to move in. By comparison, people go to parks, particularly in urban areas, because that's the only real space that's been carved out as people-oriented gathering spaces. So providing alternative routes for people to move may take some of the burden off of our park system and allow people to spread out more. The messaging can also be that these routes serve as specific access to a particular essential service, or they can serve the purpose of providing something like a 30-minute exercise loop. And you can add messaging that says, you know, this loop on this closed road would be a 30-minute bike walk, or four loops around would be a 30-minute bike ride. When we're talking about rebalancing streets, particularly park frontage roads or longer continuous routes, I think the messaging also needs to include the purpose of the facility. So we don't necessarily want people out here training hard for a triathlon. It's intended to be space for light exercise to get outside and get some sunlight and some fresh air. In some instances, it may be good to identify specific spaces on the street for pedestrians, again, so we're not mixing bicyclists who travel faster with pedestrians. So the photos are a couple examples of places that have done this already, including on Memorial Drive in Cambridge, Massachusetts, Martin Luther King Drive in Philadelphia, and Sligo Creek Parkway in Maryland. We also need to ensure that we're thinking about these opportunities in all neighborhoods. We know that lower income neighborhoods, particularly in more urban areas, often have less access to parks or parks that are within walking distance, and even less access to streets with trees. The images are from Philadelphia, where the more wealthy neighborhoods, which are on the left, have street trees, whereas the lower income neighborhoods, which used to have street trees long ago, have not been replanted or maintained. So ensuring that we're giving everyone an opportunity to get out of their house safely needs to be addressed in any city or county plans for rebalancing streets. Kids in particular should also be a big focus. I know across Ohio, many schools are going back in a hybrid model or in a virtual model. And when kids are going back to school, whether virtually, in person, or some combination, the need for safe spaces to either play outside in their own neighborhoods or travel to school is critical, especially if people are nervous about using buses. Travel patterns without school in session in their typical form should be different than expected and are probably going to be pretty impossible to predict at first. So special care should be given to selecting routes throughout town that serve a multitude of purposes and people as we sort of adapt to that new normal. One example to share is a brochure from King County, Washington, which did a lot of marketing specifically towards kids to help encourage best behavior for them. We also don't have to get it all right on the first try. We can do phased implementation, getting basic routes completed, and then filling in the gaps or making adjustments as needed. We want to ensure that we're providing some signing and in any publicity, ensure that we're explaining the intended uses and expected behavior. Providing a visual representation of what 6 feet looks like at the start of these routes can help people calibrate their distancing. So there's a bunch of examples of folks who've done that. I also don't want to put the burden on public works staff or police to observe and monitor how people are behaving. Consider using social media to capture use and behavior, or working with local community-based groups and volunteers to do that. I'd also make it clear that if people aren't following the recommended use and behavior, then the city or county might have no other option than to remove those resources. Lastly, many communities like Houston, New Orleans, Providence are focused on rapid implementation of bike networks. These are low-cost solutions to quickly build out a bicycle network in under a year so that people can actually get from one place to another on entirely low-stress and bikeable streets. These efforts do require public engagement to get community support and input, but they're not difficult or time-consuming to design and build. Building out those networks quickly can ensure that people can and will use them. It helps build support for more rapid implementation projects in the future, and it also builds support for eventually upgrading these low-cost implementations with much more permanent projects for the future. As most people on the phone, I would assume, know, ensuring that outreach efforts are reaching the traditionally underheard voices was already a challenge before this public health crisis hit. And continuing to focus on equitable outreach is going to be more important than ever. There are many people who aren't familiar with digital outreach or maybe don't have access to participate, and that needs to be addressed head on. So making sure that we ensure that the public has a voice in any decisions made now is about being transparent in those decisions, soliciting public input, and applying changes consistently across communities, and also responding to specific community requests and needs. Public input maps are a tool that many of us are familiar with, and a similar approach could be used to solicit ideas from community members to identify areas where additional space is needed. This map shows proposed bike share locations in Los Angeles, but many of these mapping tools come with the opportunity to ask survey questions in addition to geolocated intersections or corridors where people want to see a change. As part of these efforts, use the ideas we've noted so far to develop a simple toolkit of strategies applicable to your agency. This will help set up the messaging and expectations with the community of what options are feasible. Another topic we've seen come up and that we've touched on a little bit so far is that some of these rebalancing efforts might be seen as beneficial beyond just the current health crisis. And though this may be true, it's also important to understand that this isn't necessarily the time to be pushing for those. One thing that can be done is to use current or future planned projects as a starting point and utilize this crisis as an opportunity to broaden communities' minds about the possibility of using streets differently. This may not be a good time to be advocating for bike and pedestrian projects in the traditional sense, but capacity pending, it may be a good time to show what's possible in the future. So people have a lot on their minds still a lot of different needs and things that they're thinking about. And bike and pedestrian facilities might not be top of mind for people, but we can start to build in a sort of new normal and give people a chance to experience something that they might not have experienced before. Existing resources and outreach efforts might be possible to use for current projects or adapted for use as resources to apply similar efforts distributed through the community. Luckily, there's a lot of options when it comes to doing physically distant engagement on these projects, and also the projects themselves can serve as opportunities to engage. This is an example of a bunch of different physically distant engagement formats that we put together, everything from a sort of live online event like the one we're doing right now, to more self-guided static things online, small in-person group activities, or very analog self-guided opportunities. And we looked at sort of the average cost per participant and the difficulty of how hard it is to set some of these up versus how easily or how effective they are at reaching underrepresented communities and the depth of engagement that you get back. So this is, they're in the slides that Victoria shared out, and this is a great way to think about, where am I going to get the most bang for my buck in engaging with the community for this and for other projects. This is just one example of an online open house, which is a website that has a pre-recorded video message on it and lots of opportunities to engage through surveys. Something like that could also be paired with like a live online open house opportunity to talk to people and ask questions and give feedback. In terms of physically rebalancing the street specifically, there are lots of precedents to point to for examples of rapid implementation. The concept is known by many names. So rapid implementation is one we use a lot. Quick builds, demonstration projects, pilots, pop-ups, or tactical urbanism can go by many names. And though the context and application is completely different for today's crisis, the principles from this implementation approach can still be very valuable. These are just a few examples of sidewalk and curb extensions of various scales. And there's similar examples for bikeways and traffic calming that could be referenced for ways to provide additional space. So these are looking at adding additional pedestrian street through something like just a painted lane for walking, a sidewalk extension that has a little bit more of that physical separation through the parking blocks, another just painted walk and bikeway, or a curb extension at a crossing made out of tires and cones. These are all things that didn't take a lot to make happen. These are also just a few resources at various scales when we're talking about pop-up projects or demonstration projects. And they provide ideas for project types that are beyond what's needed in reaction to COVID, but many of the community engagement and messaging principles documented here can also be adapted. For example, one specific example is permitting. So maybe many of these quick build or demonstration projects are unlike things that your agency might be used to permitting. But if your agency has worked with or implemented any of these pop-up type projects, that permitting framework that you've already figured out might be a good template to start with. It looks like there was maybe a couple questions that came through. So before I pass it back to Gwen, do we want to address those?
Sounds good. Gwen, do you want to read them off?
Yeah, there was a question from Frank saying, any suggestions for managing traffic around restaurants and Grubhub, DoorDash, and other delivery service? Chipotle traffic jams was noted. Definitely, I think that this is an opportunity and something that we've seen at several different places around the country. You can repurpose the parking lane is kind of the most simplest. There's a couple different options, and I think that the most fundamental thing that you do is you make sure that you maintain sidewalk, an accessible sidewalk access path. So you want it to not be pinched. 4 foot is the bare minimum for a short length of period. 5 foot clear path is the minimum from ADA standpoints. So you want to be able to maintain 5 feet clear on the sidewalk. What that typically probably means is that you have to go to the street. And so at that point, the the considerations are making sure that that parking lane or that curbside travel lane, if there was no parking, has good protection elements, barrier elements, and that's where some of these resources that Sally was just pointing to will come in handy. The application slightly different than one of these pop-up projects, but these tactile urbanism demonstration project, the resources that exist for those are going to be very applicable for today. One thing to note if you are using the parking lane is you want to make sure that it is also accessible. So you want to make sure that it goes all the way to the corners to capture that curb ramp so that people using wheelchairs or other rolled devices can, or that just can't step over a curb physically, can access that space. I've also seen some maybe not ADA compliant, but some asphalt ramps, so they don't have the tactical domes or anything like that, but I've seen some asphalt ramps that have gotten installed at parklets or things like that mid-block to get around that issue. So I think that there's room for flexibility and creativity, and it's really kind of what your agency and the public works departments are willing and capable of doing.
Thanks.
I'm looking at some of the other questions. Yeah. One of the other ones was for reduced speed zones. What recommendations do you have for enforcement? Have temporary traffic calming methods been employed? I think the main thing, and this is kind of a big discussion in traffic engineering in general, is setting the speed limit versus designing the road in a way that truly makes cars drive slower. So I think that a lot of these traffic calming elements and these elements that we're suggesting to provide these additional spaces for people walking and biking, it comes naturally with narrowing the travel lanes, narrowing the intersection crossing distances, all of those things naturally just by geometry slow down vehicles for the most part, because you're visibly and physically narrowing the roadway in which they have to operate. So I think that the intent from what we've seen and what we've been recommending mostly is to use the design of the roadway to get those traffic calming features in and focus less on any type of enforcement or just reducing the speed limit with a sign and hoping people react, because evidence just shows that that doesn't work too well. But with having these streets changed, rebalanced, and then also hopefully by having people use them, you're just going to get that double whammy of communicating to cars that they should be going slow and sharing the space.
One thing that could help might be like the automated speed feedback trailers. I know that's a resource that a lot of the ODOT districts have. So that might be something, even to sort of test and see if your interventions are creating those lower speeds, putting those automated enforcement trailers out there could be a way to help with that.
Yeah, definitely. There was another question, and I'll read it, but I'd be curious, Sally, what your thoughts are. There might be some specific things to ODOT, but the question is from Stephanie. What would pop-up projects be considered to be experimenting with the public, which is prohibited?
That's an interesting question. I've not heard that sort of phrasing come up before, and pop-up projects are certainly being used in a lot of different places and cases, not necessarily just with COVID. They're happening in a lot of places, and they're certainly not something that you would just willy-nilly throw some cones out and see what happens. Any of these ideas that we're talking about, they need some design, they need some engineering behind them. So we wouldn't recommend doing a bike lane that didn't conform with the actual standards that we have for the minimum width for a bike lane. Also, one thing that we've talked about is trying to use projects that have already been planned, that have already been thought about, and just getting them to happen faster, because there has been a process, there has been engineering judgment and things like that, or planning judgment that have gone into putting together those plans and those ideas. So definitely not just having people go out and paint things on the street without some engineering and some process behind it, and following the guidelines. And we'll reference a few guidelines that are out there to be sure that we're doing this in a way that actually conforms with standard guidance and best practices.
Yeah, I think that, and this is, I've worked on demonstration projects, tactical urbanism projects, for several years now before COVID, and this is always the same, that kind of question of is this allowed? And something that I've seen time and time again is that there's ways to make it as MUTCD compliant as you want to, and there's ways to drastically deviate from MUTCD. So I've seen a lot of the fundamentals is you're setting it up very similar to, Chapter 6 of the MUTCD, temporary traffic control, using bollards. It's very similar in design elements to that type of stuff, but then supplemented with maybe some more safety elements for bikes and pedestrians, but then also just some more, community focused elements. So that's where you can start to deviate from the MUTCD so that you're not just putting orange traffic construction looking things on the road. There's a lot of faux MUTCD, I guess, is kind of a way that I've said it in the past, where you can get as close to MUTCD as possible, and so be in nature of, but not quite be exactly what those requirements are. And so that's where you can get things like planters, other types of barriers, maybe white cones instead of orange cones, which maybe, and then it comes into the cost and all of that stuff. So there's a lot of different nuance and trade-offs, but I think as Sally was noting, these types of projects have precedent before COVID happened. And so you want to look to places within your region, within your state, and maybe elsewhere, just to kind of see how those things have been done, because this is a common question of just, are they experimenting, and is that allowed? And that's where documentation and kind of the transparency also comes into it, is being upfront and collecting data and evaluating it along the way to ensure those things are covered. I didn't have any other questions on my end. Were there any for Sally, or should we kind of wrap this up and then go into discussion?
There's no other questions right now.
Okay. Well, then I'll wrap this up, and then we can go back to discussion, because I think there's plenty to talk about. So throw ideas in as I go through these last few slides. We need to pull it all together. We need to simultaneously think big and think small, and make sure that people throughout our towns and cities have places where they can walk and bike, including and especially in lower income neighborhoods, because they are even less likely to have yards, neighborhood parks within walking distance, or streets with sidewalks and street trees. We need to think about the longer routes like the city of Winnipeg has. On April 6th, way long ago, they began restricting vehicles on 4 streets during the day. This is one way to make sure there is enough space so that people aren't crowded on just one route. We need to think about those park roads that could be closed to traffic, like here in San Francisco. Next slide, please. But we also need to think about local streets that we can repurpose as walking and bicycling streets. We can plan these in areas where there are other easily accessible alternative routes for emergency access, maybe those parallel routes next to the bigger road. We need to think about the time of day restrictions, and also consider the capacity of local public works staff. Just like everyone else, their responsibilities are changing during this pandemic. We need to re-examine their workloads and make sure they have the capacity to implement these solutions, and also make sure they are safe while doing so. So in addition to social media, sites like Streetsblog and Strong Towns are other resources to turn to see what other communities are doing. NACDO has launched and has been sustaining and building upon almost every week, basically, an amazing resource guide response to COVID, and they have a ton of different things. So I think a couple of you may have seen, they have within their tools for rapid responses, there's a whole entire street typology for different interventions that have been going on in response to COVID. There's on-the-ground updates, which is just constantly updated webinars, resources, all sorts of stuff. They're tracking and monitoring federal funding updates that are relevant to transportation, and then they're also just compiling any and all resources that they can. There's the Vision Zero Network, APBP community, ITE community. PedBike Info has also managed, they've worked with Tabitha Combs at the University of North Carolina to compile this giant list of kind of compiling the local actions that have happened across the world. They actually just shifted in the last 2 days. So before we updated these slides, they now have Shifting Streets, yet another database that's very similar to this, but compiles a couple other layers of information on and is more focused in the long term. Like, okay, now that, so this one that we have shown on the screen, the local actions, that was kind of tracking what people are doing. This next new data set is really tracking, so what's going to happen going forward? And it's similar in that it's tracking all the interventions, but it's also tracking the next steps and going to continue to follow them. So that's really exciting. The next slide just kind of quickly goes through some of those street typologies that I was mentioning. So if you click a couple times, Sally, there's just, they've come up with like 12 plus different street types of different things with all these graphics. With each of these graphics comes a one-pager on tips, tricks, considerations, things like that. So NACTO is, of course, wealth of information. Also, as we noted earlier, a lot of these pop-up tactical urbanism type projects, the concepts are similar but different, but the resources that have been developed to support those are plenty. And so this Tactile Urbanist Guide to Materials and Design kind of is what I was talking about earlier, where you can go deviate a little bit from the MUTCD. And then there's Chapter 6 of the MUTCD, and it's also Chapter 6 of the Ohio MUTCD, I believe. So similar thing. And then finally, we worked with FHWA last year to work on a bicycle facility selection class, and that class course has been made available online for free. So there is now that course is available, and professional development hours are available as well to take it. And I know that I've flipped through it and have learned a wealth of information. So I think that it's just another great one to get those design aspects locked in so that you can get creative with the implementation and material implementation strategies. So I think with that is all we have for today, and more questions and discussion is next.
Thanks, Gwen. Yeah, we have at least one question coming in already. I would love to hear from folks in the audience what other questions you have, but also have any of the folks on the call, have your communities experimented with any of these types of interventions? I know that Cincinnati and Columbus have both worked on trying to have use outdoor space for more restaurant dining. So I would love to hear if anybody on the line has tried any of this out locally. The question that I got in the box right now is suggestions for ideas for managing pedestrian traffic, bikers, and scooter riders on urban college campuses where campus and shared walkways merge with public sidewalks. They're currently using yard signs for social distancing and to remind people to use masks at choke points. Gwen, do you have any first thoughts on that? I think my first thought is that obviously partnering with the city is going to be really important, and thinking about how those uses are also important uses for the city itself, to try to work on a solution for those roads that can expand space for pedestrian traffic. I think, yeah, as colleges are coming back, this is a whole other thing to think about, where you've got a lot more students on campus. We're trying to keep them separated as much as possible. If it's a small town where the college students make up a big portion of the population, it's a whole new dynamic that we're trying to figure out right now.
Yeah, and I don't have too much more to add to that. I think it could be treated, at least for those like the outside roads, kind of the ring roads that are on the edges, could be treated similar to parks, where you just acknowledge that there's going to be a lot of heavy biking and walking traffic on those roads and need for space. And so it might make sense to remove a vehicle travel lane or something like that. It depends on what the layout of the street is, obviously. But yeah, if you could supplement that space around the edges, it might help alleviate some of the internal roads. I think it's really key what you said earlier, Sally, about making sure the community, or that the college and the local agency or department are working together and on the same page, because the messaging, those lines get blurred real quickly. And so I think making sure that there's cohesive messaging, because that's going to be the best way to achieve compliance, is if people are getting the same messages. Anything mixed messaging is definitely not going to help. So I think that is one strategy. I don't know about campuses. I saw that noted here in Portland, like someone was noticing that there's signs up at some campuses that have previously been like mostly open to the public, or at least have portions open to the public, that are now asking, I don't know how formally this is, but they're asking that people that are not college students or staff to not come onto campus anymore and recreate in their lawn and their yards and stuff. And that's obviously a big miss to the public, or a thing that gets taken away to the public, but I don't necessarily blame the colleges for taking that approach, considering there's just a lot going on. So I think it will be interesting, and I don't have a solution, but it's something that I think we'll have to probably start thinking about more and more.
Yeah, that's a challenge where the college campus, I mean, I know that I spent a lot of time walking around on college campus over the summer, using that as another space to recreate. So it certainly could be sort of a conflict of colleges, doing their best to try to keep everybody safe on campus, whereas it also serves as that amenity to the community. So yeah, trying to keep those lines of communication open, thinking about, I don't think you want to separate the college, but thinking about if there's roads through campus that could be closed down to provide those routes for walking that are more on campus and separated from traffic. We have a couple other questions. So one is, have there been any anecdotal instances of temporary traffic control, like cones and barriers, etc., being vandalized or accidentally moved when creating curb extensions, bike lanes, closures, etc.?
I've seen a couple, but I've also, for the most part, seen them be successful. I know, like when in like June-ish, when time is nothing these days, but there was, when things were first starting to hit the roads, of cities were starting to put up those signs and stuff, I saw a lot of pictures, of course, online of them being thrown to the side. But I also want to acknowledge that you often aren't going to see the pictures of the success as much. So, just using social media may not be the best path. Here in Portland, I think that I've heard very mixed results. I think it kind of depends on how you have that, what the maintenance is set up for. I haven't seen much vandalism in terms of like graffiti marking up. A lot of it is just people moving them out of the way, and whether that's people who are in cars that want to be able to get down this road that they perceive as blocked off, or if it's just people that, for whatever reason, take it upon themselves to move it out of the place that it's supposed to be. I haven't seen a ton of damage or, vandalism in that sense, breaking them.
Yeah,
Curious
and I would
what
think,
you think, Sally. Yeah.
Yeah, I would think a couple things. One would be, especially when we're looking at those sort of neighborhood level, like residential street closures, making sure that the neighborhood is part of the process and part of the conversation, and that they want this to be there, obviously is going to be really important. And then you have another set of eyes on the ground that can alert you if things have gotten moved out of place, making sure that, it's clear who to contact. If it's just through a regular 311 process, or if there's someone else to contact if something seems like it's gotten run into or moved or anything like that. All right, so then we've got, any tips for intersections specifically where you have groups of people temporarily queuing and waiting to cross? So I would say, to start with, making sure that we talked a little bit about what signal timing you're using, thinking about prioritizing the crossing time over prioritizing queuing of vehicles, because you have this added safety concern. That would be sort of my first thought, is if you're seeing that and looking at the signal timing, and maybe if there's possibilities to use those nighttime signals, or move to a longer crossing time,
Here, yeah,
cross more often.
Here in Portland, they just within the last couple of weeks have started the third phase of their Safe Streets program, which was the first phase was kind of the residential slow streets. The second phase was the healthy businesses, which was kind of, the outdoor dining, partial and full closures for that. And then this third one that I think it's just called Busy Streets is on the more busy streets. And what they're doing are they're doing paint and post curb extensions at some of the major intersections to do exactly that, to provide that additional space for people queuing and waiting to cross the street. So I'd be happy to kind of make sure that some photos of or an article about this gets included in whatever debrief we send out. But there is, so that's been going on. I haven't heard how successful it's been. It's only started within the last couple of weeks, and I think that there's, from what I can tell, there may be some room for improvement, but I've also heard that it's, if you do it on all four corners, you're pretty quickly and easily drastically changing the way people drive at the intersection and through the intersection, and therefore just by also providing more space, you're just making it more comfortable and more safe for people. The other thing that they're doing on busy streets is they're creating kind of asphalt quick build bus platforms, I guess, so that the buses can stop in lane, and so that the bus island can go out and expand or provide more space for queuing at major bus stops. So that's kind of being done in conjunction with those curb extensions. So is pretty quickly and cheaply changing those streets specifically for providing more space for queuing and walking.
Great. That covers all of the questions that I see in the box right now. We have a couple minutes left. So if anybody has any further questions or comments they want to shoot over, we are happy to answer them still.
Yep, there's no more additional questions in the box, but I know that we have your contact information, and I will include that when we send it out as a follow-up after the webinar is completed. So I want to thank you both for the topic today. It has been very eye-opening and really thought-provoking for us as we deal with active transportation in this time of the COVID virus. So hopefully there'll be a lot of good ideas and plans that come out of attendance at this webinar today.
Great, thanks. And yeah, if you let us know if you need help, if you're interested in getting some technical assistance on choosing pilot streets or deciding on design measures, anything like that, please reach out to me. My email is on the screen. And definitely follow us on Twitter, because we're sharing as much as possible examples of places that are doing this, and also, places that are trying to move these into more permanent projects. So definitely check us out there. Thank you, everybody who spent some time to come to this today. And yeah, I look forward to any follow-up questions that you might have.
Sounds good. We don't have any more right now, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap things up for everyone. Thank you for your time today, and we look forward to hosting you on a future LTAP webinar. Take care.
Thanks.